To understand, as human beings, we all want to know causation. What causes something else to happen? The difficulty is in assigning causation with many of our exposures in our modern world. The historical way in which it was done involved something called Kochs postulates. Koch lived in the late 1800s, and he developed a series of postulates to explain causation. These were done in the context of infectious disease. What he said is that if you took a person, let's say, that had some kind of an infection, he was primarily looking at bacterial infections, and you were able to isolate bacteria from them and take those bacteria, grow them up outside of the person in some kind of flask or in a vial or something, and take those and inject them into another species, an animal, usually rabbits, mice, but it could be any animal, and you could cause the same disease that occurred in that person in the animal. That was proof of causation. That was sort of like 100% kind of causation. Well, that's a very mathematical kind of formula. The problem is that when we talk about dental amalgams or any kind of other exposures, lots of people are exposed to these things. We all know that. Only some of us develop disease. So instead, there's obviously a much broader explanation that's necessary. And that's where, in the world of epidemiology, these criteria have been developed. They're called Bradford Hill criteria. He was a very famous epidemiologist in the mid-1900s who said, obviously, we have lots of exposures, only some people have disease. We have to make an inference, as opposed to direct, an inference as to causation. And he developed a whole series of criteria of various things you might need in order to prove causation. You don't need all of them. Some of them suffice, and it's a gray line when you cross that line. That's why people might disagree. I might say it causes somebody next to me say, well, maybe not quite enough to prove causation yet. And what he described are some very simple things to understand. One of the most basic is the relationship of cause and effect. If you have an exposure, it needs to precede the outcome. If you have somebody, let's say, that has Alzheimer's, and it turns out, well, the mercury exposure occurred after they had Alzheimer's, it can't cause. I mean, we all understand that. So mercury exposure would have to happen, then you get the diagnosis to allow, it's called a temporal relationship. Another element of it that's very important is animal studies. What happens in an animal if you inject mercury? Where does it go? Does it persist? What kind of damage does it cause? Does it look like what the person is suffering from? In addition, he describes the plausibility of it. Is it scientifically plausible? Are we saying that in the case of mercury, well, is it damaging the brain? That's a very plausible thing. If we say that something that doesn't even go to the brain is damaging the brain, that's very implausible, not impossible, but implausible. So plausibility provides an element. In addition, he described epidemiology, observing large numbers of people. Do people who have the exposure tend to have more risk of the outcome? So that can be important. Also, understanding the elements of susceptibility. How does this work? What makes one person affected and not another? And there are many more like this.